The senator is staring at the table, not at the food, not at the wine, not at the flame of the oil lamp casting amber light across marble he has eaten off 100 times before. He is staring at the wood grain of the table itself, the specific knot in the surface 3 inches from his right hand, because looking anywhere else means looking at the empty space beside him, and the empty space beside him is where his wife was sitting 20 seconds ago. She walked in on his arm. She is no longer on his arm. The room keeps eating. That is the part that splits you open when you sit with it long enough, not the act itself but the sound. The clink of silver against ceramic. The low murmur of voices keeping themselves carefully, deliberately at the register of ordinary conversation. The soft percussion of someone refilling a goblet on the far side of the room. The liquid sound of wine filling the silence that nobody in this dining room will acknowledge. Because the man who just took that woman is the man who can have every person at this table killed before the wine has finished pouring. And so the room eats, it chews, it swallows, it maintains the performance of a dinner party with the rigid precision of soldiers holding a formation under fire, because that is exactly what this is. The most powerful men in the known world, performing normalcy at sword point, without a sword in sight. When she comes back, her husband will nod. He will rearrange his face into something that resembles composure. He will take a sip of whatever is in his goblet and hold it in his mouth a moment too long, and then the emperor will start talking, loudly, in detail, about her, about everything, to the room, including the husband, the man who will sit there with wine cooling in his goblet and a smile carved onto his face like something that was never attached to any feeling he has ever had, and he will nod because nodding is the only option that ends with him walking out of this palace. A man who was actually in that room recorded what happened at those dinners. Not a historian writing from rumor 80 years later, but a philosopher named Philo, dispatched from Alexandria as part of a diplomatic embassy in 38 AD, who watched the emperor operate up close and wrote down what he saw. His account is cold-eyed and precise and carries the specific weight of testimony. The women brought by their husbands were inspected. He and the Roman biographer Suetonius both confirm. The emperor would select one, leave with her, return, and then deliver his verdict to the assembled room. Her qualities, her deficiencies, the details of her performance, the way a man might discuss a horse he had just ridden, to the husband, in front of everyone. That is what Rome's dinner parties became. That is the specific texture of the horror that was operating inside the most powerful house on earth in 39 AD. And it was not the beginning, it was the middle. And what made it possible, what allowed a man to build this machine and run it, night after night, inside a civilization that called itself the greatest in history? That story begins far from the Palatine. It begins with a child in military boots 2 sizes too big for him. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. Born August 31st, 12 AD, to Germanicus, Rome's golden general, the man whose name alone could quiet a mutinous legion and whose troops, hardened men who had spent years on the frontier, would have carried him into the sea if he'd asked them to. Gaius grew up not in the marble corridors of Roman aristocracy, but on the Rhine frontier, the raw edge of empire, where the ground was frozen 6 months a year and the air smelled of iron and wood smoke, and the particular tension of a camp that knows an enemy is somewhere in the tree line. His mother dressed him in a miniature legionary uniform, down to the tiny soldier's boots, Caligula, that the troops found so delightful they gave the general's son his nickname on the spot. Caligula, little boot. They meant it as a gift, as love even. Nobody could have told you, in those years on the Rhine with those laughing soldiers and that adored father, what the name would eventually mean. His father died when Gaius was 7. Germanicus died in Syria in 19 AD, suddenly, without adequate explanation, in circumstances that the Roman world spent decades whispering about. The official account said illness. The unofficial accounts passed between people who had been paying close attention to the relationship between Germanicus and the Emperor Tiberius, a relationship threaded through with professional envy, strategic suspicion, and the particular coldness of a man who knows that someone else is more beloved than he will ever be, pointed elsewhere. Tiberius's ally Piso governed Syria at the time. Piso was later tried. He died before the verdict. The truth has never been established with certainty. What was established within months was the political consequence. Tiberius looked at Germanicus's family, at his fierce outspoken widow Agrippina the Elder, at his sons who carried their father's legendary name and saw not grief but a competing bloodline. Agrippina the Elder was exiled in 29 AD on charges of treason. She died in that exile. Two of Gaius's older brothers were destroyed, one starved in confinement, one forced to his own death. The beloved general's children had become liabilities to be managed. Gaius watched every piece of this. He was a child when it started. He was a young man by the time it was finished. And through all of it, through the exile of his mother, the deaths of his brothers, the years that followed under his grandmother Antonia's protection, he could not protest, could not resist, could not grieve with the volume the situation deserved, because visible grief was political signal, and political signal was dangerous. He learned, the way people learn things that cost them everything to absorb, that survival in proximity to power requires the complete suppression of the authentic self. Then in 32 AD, he was summoned to Capri. Capri was where Tiberius had retreated from public life in 26 AD, leaving Rome to run itself through intermediaries while he governed from an island villa at a careful distance from the city he no longer trusted. The island had become over those years a gilded compression chamber, a court built on fear, where every relationship was surveillance and every conversation was potential evidence. Gaius arrived there in his early 20s, knowing the full accounting of what Tiberius had done to his family. He stayed for 6 years of morning salutations, of shared dinners, of performing daily and with complete commitment the role of a grateful ward in the household of the man who had killed his mother and his brothers. Tiberius watched him do it and reportedly said he was nursing a viper for Rome. He said it with what the sources suggest was a note of professional appreciation, one strategist recognizing the quality of another's performance. What Tiberius didn't fully account for was the specific kind of transformation that 6 years of that performance produces. Gaius didn't crack under those years, he hardened, and the thing that hardened in him was not resilience, not dignity, not the kind of strength that makes a man better. It was the crystallized understanding that the rules governing what one person may take from another are fictional, that they exist only insofar as someone is willing to enforce them, that at the apex of absolute power, the only limit is the one you impose on yourself. He had watched Tiberius for 6 years. Tiberius had imposed no limits on himself whatsoever. On the 16th of March 37 AD, Tiberius died at 77. The celebrations that followed were extraordinary. 160,000 animals sacrificed across the empire, in acts of public thanksgiving, 3 months of rejoicing in Rome, crowds weeping in the streets, but not with grief, with relief. The son of Germanicus, the survivor, the people's prince, Rome told itself that everything terrible was behind it now. Rome had never been more precisely wrong. There is a concept that matters more than any single crime Caligula committed. Historians and psychologists who study systems of coercive control call it a total environment, not a place, exactly, not a room or a building or a defined geography. A total environment is an atmosphere, a set of conditions so comprehensively constructed that every person inside them is implicated in maintaining them, whether they choose to be or not. A total environment doesn't require guards at every door or a tyrant watching every move. It requires something more efficient and more durable than surveillance. It requires that the people inside it understand, at a level below conscious thought, that stepping outside the bounds of what the environment permits will cost them everything. Caligula built one. He didn't build it deliberately, the way an architect designs a building. He built it the way a person builds anything they've been trained for, by doing what came naturally, given what he'd been taught. What Capri had taught him was that a total environment already existed, that Tiberius had constructed one on that island and used it to govern Rome for a decade from a distance. All Caligula needed to do was expand it to the scale of the empire and refine the specific mechanism by which it operated. The mechanism was humiliation, not random cruelty, not the disorganized violence of a man who has simply lost control of himself. Targeted, calibrated, deliberate humiliation. The kind that takes the most dignified people in a civilization and strips them of dignity in front of each other, so that the shared experience of having been stripped creates a bond more powerful than loyalty. Because loyalty can be transferred, complicity cannot. Complicity is permanent. Complicity binds you to the person who created the conditions for your shame, because the only alternative is to acknowledge what you did and did not do. And in a civilization that ran on dignitas, on honor, on the carefully maintained fiction of the senatorial class, as the noblest expression of human civilization, that acknowledgement was worse than death. This is why the Senate allowed it. Not because they didn't know, not because they were naive or ignorant or simply too frightened to move. They knew exactly what was happening. Cassius Dio, writing his history of this period, records that practically everyone at Caligula's court wanted him dead. The Roman historian Tacitus, whose account of these years has been almost entirely lost but whose other work illuminates the atmosphere, described the court in the phrase occulte Gaium, inside, hidden malice toward Gaius. The hatred was total, and it was known. The paralysis was not ignorance. It was the total environment working exactly as designed. To move against Caligula, any senator or general would have had to recruit other senators and generals. To recruit them, he would have had to speak plainly about what was happening. To speak plainly about what was happening, he would have had to name the dinners, the inspections, the husbands who sat at those tables and nodded. And naming those things meant asking men who had already paid the price of silence, who had already purchased survival with their dignity, to confess publicly that they had sat there, that they had watched, that they had arranged their faces, that they had in that particular sense participated. The total environment made every potential conspirator a hostage of his own compliance. And now Caligula, newly risen from his sickbed in 38 AD, changed in ways that even friendly ancient sources struggle to describe without the language of rupture, something snapping, some last governor releasing, turned this mechanism against the women of Rome's aristocracy with a systematic commitment that went beyond appetite into something closer to architecture. The first documented case is a wedding. In 38 AD, Caligula attended the marriage of a man named Gaius Calpurnius Piso to a woman named Livia Orestilla. The ceremony itself was a formal aristocratic occasion, the kind of event an emperor's attendance would have elevated into something historic, something the family would speak of for generations. Guests arrived dressed for a celebration. The torches were lit, the wine was poured. Livia Orestilla stood at the center of a room full of people, whose presence was meant to witness and sanctify the joining of two families. Caligula looked at her and made a decision. He turned to the groom at the table and said, not quietly, not with any gesture toward courtesy, "Don't take liberties with my wife." Then he had her taken from the room. The groom sat at his own wedding feast. The torches stayed lit. The wine was still in the cups, and somewhere in that room, beneath the sound of whatever conversation anyone could manufacture, there was a silence so complete it had texture, the silence of 30 or 40 people absorbing in real time what they had just witnessed and understanding simultaneously that they would not be speaking of it. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not in any way that reached official record. Caligula issued a proclamation the following day announcing that he had married in the manner of Romulus, invoking the ancient myth of the rape of the Sabine women, in which the founders of Rome had seized the daughters of neighboring tribes by force as a foundational act of civilization. He was not concealing what he'd done, he was framing it as precedent. He was saying, this is not a crime, this is Roman tradition, this is what men of sufficient power have always done, and the only reason it looks strange is that most men lack sufficient power. He divorced her within days. When she later resumed contact with her former husband, he banished her entirely. The second case arrived almost immediately, and it came from a greater distance, which was itself the point. Lollia Paulina was not in Rome when the summons found her. She was in the provinces, accompanying her husband Gaius Memmius, a general of consular rank commanding armies at the edge of empire. She was, by every conventional measure, protected by geography, by her husband's status, by the ordinary logic of an aristocratic Roman marriage that placed her firmly within his household and his jurisdiction. A courier arrived with an imperial command. Memmius held the paper. He knew what it was. He knew what refusing it meant. He watched his wife leave for Rome. She arrived. She was married to the emperor. She was discarded within months, and then, in the specific cruelty that distinguished Caligula's treatment of women from mere appetite, she was formally banned from forming any relationship with any other man, anywhere, for the remainder of her life. He had no further use for her. He ensured by imperial decree that no one else would be permitted to have use of her either. The logic was not jealousy, It was property law. She had been his. That categorization did not expire. But the weddings and the summons, the visible, documented, named cases, were only the public surface of something that ran much deeper, something that operated not once or twice but repeatedly, routinely, in the most intimate social spaces Rome's aristocracy possessed. The dinner table. Suetonius records it in a passage whose clinical brevity is its most disturbing quality. At banquets, the women brought by their husbands were inspected. If it pleased the emperor, he would leave with them. On his return, he would provide the room with his assessment, her qualities, her deficiencies, her performance, specific details, delivered aloud to the assembled guests, in the presence of the husband. Picture the specific mechanics of that room, the long tables, the lamplight casting orange shadows across the faces of men who are holding themselves very still, the smell of roasted meat, and the sweetness of malsum, wine mixed with honey, and beneath it something else, something that doesn't have a name in Latin, but that everyone in that room can smell anyway. The sound of the emperor's footsteps as he returns. The sound of a goblet being set down very carefully on marble. The specific quality of silence that occurs when a room full of people is listening as hard as it can while performing the act of not listening. And then his voice. The most powerful man in the world, describing in detail the intimate qualities of a woman whose husband is sitting 6 feet away, and the husband is nodding, and the room is attending to its food, and somewhere in the texture of that silence is the sound of an entire civilization paying the price of the total environment it had allowed to be built around it. This was the machine, not a dungeon, not a torture chamber, a dinner party, a social occasion with torchlight and silver and the finest food the empire could produce. The horror dressed in every marker of civilization, operating at the very center of the world's most powerful court, and everyone in the room participating, not because they wanted to, but because the architecture of the environment had foreclosed every other option. Caligula had learned this at Capri. He had sat at those tables himself and performed and endured and stored every detail of how it was done. Now it was his table, and somewhere in the palace, in the rooms off the corridors the guests never saw, something was happening with the sisters that Rome would spend 2,000 years arguing about. There was a man at one of those palace gatherings who was not Roman. His name was Philo, a Jewish philosopher from Alexandria, dispatched to Rome as part of a diplomatic embassy in 38 AD. Petitioning Caligula on behalf of the Jewish community in Alexandria. He had no reason to protect Caligula's reputation. He had no reason to rehabilitate it, either. He was an outsider, educated, observant, accustomed to recording what he witnessed, and he spent enough time at the imperial court to watch the emperor move through his environment, interact with his court, and conduct the business of being Rome's absolute ruler. What Philo describes is not a man who has lost his mind. He describes a man who is performing, who understands theatre, who knows exactly how the appearance of divine authority operates on ordinary people who are trying to make rational calculations about their survival, who is, in Philo's careful and slightly horrified account, entirely in control of what he is doing and why. The insanity of Caligula, the convenient narrative that lets the civilization that produced him off the hook by locating the problem in a single defective brain rather than in the systems that elevated that brain to absolute authority, is not what Philo saw. What Philo also did not see, or at least did not record, was incest. In a court where gossip moved at the speed of breath, in a palace where every corridor carried rumors and every servant was a potential informant, a man who was present and watching carefully noted no incestuous behavior in his written account. The absence is not proof, but it is evidence of a kind that tends to get lost when the lurid version of this story crowds out the documented one. The 3 sisters Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, Livilla, were Caligula's closest surviving family. The only people alive who had shared the specific experience of watching their mother and brothers be systematically destroyed while they were still children. When Caligula took the throne, he elevated all 3 to a level of public honor with no precedent in Roman history. Their faces appeared on the imperial coinage, previously reserved for deceased women of the imperial house. The Senate swore loyalty oaths that included their names. They were, functionally, members of the ruling house, in a way that Roman tradition had never authorized for living women. This was already transgressive, already ostentatious, already the kind of gesture that made a court whisper. Caligula made no effort to quiet the whispers. He may have amplified them. Here is what the ancient sources actually say, not the collapsed tabloid version, but the precise language of the records themselves. Suetonius, writing approximately 80 years after Caligula's death from court documents he had access to as an imperial secretary, claims incest with all three sisters. Drusilla above all. He says the relationship began in childhood, that their grandmother Antonia found them together, that Caligula later abducted Drusilla from her husband Cassius Longinus and lived with her openly as his wife. Suetonius was a brilliant researcher and an enthusiastic sensationalist, and those two qualities coexisted in his work in ways that require the reader to hold both simultaneously. Tacitus, the most analytically rigorous of the Roman historians, a man who treated evidence with a seriousness that marks him as genuinely modern in his methodology, presents the incest as allegations. He records that the accusations existed. He does not confirm them. Cassius Dio, writing nearly 2 centuries after the reign, mentions an intimate relationship only with Drusilla, not all three. His account is less specific and markedly less confident than Suetonius's, and Philo, who was there, records nothing. What the incest accusation fits with almost perfect precision is a specific rhetorical template used in ancient political character assassination, the charge of Eastern despotism. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, whom Caligula openly admired and deliberately referenced in aspects of his self-presentation, had practiced sibling marriage as standard dynastic policy for generations. Every Ptolemaic ruler had a sister wife named Cleopatra, as a matter of near mechanical convention. To accuse Caligula of incest was to say, in the language Rome's literary class would have recognized immediately, this man has decided he is a Ptolemaic pharaoh. He has placed himself outside the civilization he governs. He is alien, monstrous, not Roman. That framing served the interests of everyone who wrote about him after his death. It served the Julio-Claudian successors who needed his legacy to be as toxic as possible. It served the senatorial class, whose members had been humiliated at his dinner tables and who needed their humiliation to be the result of genuine madness rather than a system they had collectively failed to stop. But here is the thing that gets swallowed when the incest story takes over. Whether or not Caligula's relationship with Drusilla was sexual, the death of Drusilla in 38 AD broke him in a way the ancient sources cannot fully account for through the language of ordinary grief. He fled Rome in the middle of the night, on foot, without ceremony, driving through Campania to the coast and taking a ship to Syracuse, returning without shaving or cutting his hair or eating properly for days. He declared a formal public mourning period during which it was a capital offense to laugh, to bathe, to dine with your own family. That was grief of a magnitude that Roman convention had no container for. Whatever Drusilla was to him, sister, wife, anchor, the only person in his adult life who may have loved him without calculating the political cost, her death removed the last thing that looked like a human attachment. And what followed it, in the months that led to 39 AD, had a quality the sources describe with a brevity that fails to conceal the horror underneath, a court in which the women had started to go quiet, not silent with fear. They had been silent with fear for a year by then. Something else, something that long-term fear, held at maximum intensity without relief, eventually produces, the ancient sources note in passing, in clauses that don't slow down to examine what they're describing, that some women at court had become unreachable, that they moved through rooms as though watching from a distance, that they stopped speaking in ways that connected to the conversations around them. There is no Latin term for dissociation. The phenomenon has no framework in Roman medical thought. What the sources record instead is behavioral, the description of women who have the specific appearance of people whose minds have traveled somewhere else because the place their bodies are living has become intolerable. The stories of the palace brothel belong to this same atmospheric record, and they require the same careful reading. Suetonius describes an operation within the palace rooms, noble women, a formal system. The word brothel appears and has echoed through 2,000 years of retelling as though it named a defined institution with walls and signage. The historian Thomas McGinn, examining the original sources closely, traced the story back to Cassius Dio's actual account, which describes newly constructed suites of rooms in the palace, filled with noble tenants paying exorbitant rents for imperial proximity and praetorian protection. No brothel appears in Dio's version. What Suetonius appears to have done is take the real and documented pattern, the coercive use of women at banquets, the treatment of aristocratic wives as available by imperial prerogative, the culture of forced compliance that ran through the entire court, and compressed it into the more legible image of a formal institution. But here is what that compression loses. A brothel implies containment, a designated room, a bounded crime. The total environment had no such walls. The violation was at the dinner table, at the wedding ceremony, in the summons that reached a general's wife in a distant province and pulled her out of her husband's hands. It was in the silence of every husband who sat through those dinners, in the nod that each of them managed, in the specific quality of the room's sound, the clink of a goblet, the soft movement of a servant, the absence of any voice raised in objection, that Caligula required his court to produce, night after night, as evidence that he had converted the most powerful men in the world into the architecture of his own impunity. That is not a brothel, that is a total environment. And total environments are far harder to name, harder to prosecute, and much harder to dismantle than any room with walls. The senators at those tables understood this on some level, in the part of themselves that had performed compliance often enough to understand its cost. They understood that they were not witnesses to a crime. They were the crime's necessary condition. And somewhere in the court, a decorated veteran who had served under Caligula's father and been assigned degrading passwords by Caligula's court and shown up anyway, every time, was arriving at the outer limit of what a calculation of survival can bear. His name was Cassius Chaerera, and he had been very patient. The Palatine Games. The games were theatre, elaborate, expensive, the kind of spectacle Caligula staged with an urgency that had moved past vanity into something closer to need. He needed the crowd assembled. He needed Rome's noise surrounding him, confirming by its volume that everything he had built was permanent and solid. He needed perhaps the specific reassurance that comes from standing at the center of 50,000 people's attention and feeling the weight of it press outward against the walls of the world. He left through the cryptoporticus at midday. It was a covered passage, vaulted stone, dim even at noon. The kind of underground corridor that exists in every large ancient building for the movement of people who need to travel without being seen. Cool in summer, acoustically strange, the sounds of the games above muffled to a distant percussion. He was going to bathe. He was, by all available accounts, relaxed. The men walking with him were the men who had always walked with him. He had no reason to believe the corridor was different from any other corridor he had walked. Cassius Chaerera was waiting. No speech, no formal accusation, no theatrical moment of the kind Caligula would have produced if their positions had been reversed. Chaerera had attended too many of those performances. He had stood in too many rooms maintaining the correct expression while the emperor demonstrated, one more time, the specific quality of his power over the people required to witness it. The first blow was a sword across the neck, the throat, specifically, which is either coincidence or the unconscious selection of a soldier who had spent years listening to what that throat produced at those dinner tables. The blow did not kill him immediately. Caligula fell and attempted to run. Cornelius Sabinus was positioned behind him. What followed in that corridor was not an assassination in the clean political sense of a calculated strike against a specific target. It was the physical expression of everything that had accumulated in that court over 4 years, in the dining rooms, in the forced silences, in the passwords designed to humiliate decorated soldiers, in the eyes of women who had learned to look at the middle distance. Suetonius records 30 wounds. The conspirators continued after he was no longer moving. Cassius Dio, who was rarely given to understatement, allowed himself one line. Caligula, he wrote, learned by actual experience that he was not a god. The Germanic bodyguards found him first. These were men whose loyalty was personal and absolute, sworn not to Rome or the office of emperor, but to Caligula specifically, the particular person whose body now lay in the cryptoporticus. For them, the assassination was not justice or liberation or the correction of a broken system. It was the murder of their man. And in the minutes that followed, the palace became something that looked like a battlefield that nobody had declared. The bodyguards moving through corridors, cutting down servants and officials with the specific blind fury of grief that has no target equal to the one it has lost, and so expands to fill whatever space is available. The women of the court heard this from wherever they had gone quiet. They heard the shouting, the clang of metal on stone, the sound of running feet, and then the particular silence that followed, not the silence of the emperor asleep, not the silence of the corridor before the summons arrives, but something without precedent in the vocabulary of sounds they had spent 4 years learning to read. Something had ended. They pressed themselves against walls and waited to discover whether what came next would be an improvement. They had no particular reason to assume it would be. Claudius was found behind a curtain. He had concealed himself there when the chaos began. Suetonius records this detail without comment, which is its own kind of commentary, apparently under the impression that sufficient stillness might allow the reorganization of the world to proceed without noticing him specifically. A Praetorian soldier found him crouching there, and rather than cutting him down, brought him to his colleagues. Within hours, the Praetorian Guard had its new emperor. The Senate met in the Capitol in emergency session and debated, briefly and without serious conviction, the restoration of the Republic. This debate, theoretically possible since Augustus had concentrated all institutional authority into a single office 70 years earlier, lasted exactly as long as it took the Guard to make clear the direction their swords were pointing. Claudius was emperor. The Julio-Claudian dynasty would continue. Claudius was not an unintelligent man. History has tended to underestimate him because the ancient sources, shaped by the culture Caligula had done so much to define, treated his stammer and his scholarly pursuits as evidence of weakness, but Claudius had survived Caligula's court by making himself appear too insignificant to be worth destroying, which is itself a form of political intelligence that requires considerable precision to execute over 4 years in close proximity to a paranoid emperor. He now faced an empire that knew, in its bones and its dinner party silences, exactly what had been happening inside the Palatine Hill. He understood what accounting for it would require. To prosecute Caligula's crimes against the women of Rome would mean naming the dinners, naming the inspections, naming every senator who had sat at those tables and arranged his face and paid the price of one more night of survival. To prosecute the crimes meant dismantling the total environment by naming every person whose participation had made it function. To prosecute Caligula, Claudius would have had to prosecute Rome. He chose silence instead. Official, institutional, permanent silence, not the silence of someone who didn't understand what had happened, but the silence of someone who understood it completely and knew that naming it would cost him the loyalty of every man who had survived it by complying. Livia Orestia went home. Lollia Paulina went home. The wives who had been taken from those dinner tables, who had been returned to their husbands with whatever was left of them after Caligula had finished his assessment of their qualities and their deficiencies, they went home to villas that looked exactly as they had before and were utterly unrecognizable. Families received, in some cases, money, dowries, gifts, the specific currency of settlements that are offered not in acknowledgement of harm, but in purchase of silence. What was bought with those payments was the family's agreement to fold what had happened into the category of things that did not officially occur. Roman aristocratic culture measured a woman's worth through the concept of honor, not her honor as she experienced it, not her integrity or intelligence or the specific weight of her particular life, but the social fiction of her purity as it existed in the perceptions of the people who would decide her marriage prospects and her family's standing. These women had not chosen what was done to them. They had not consented, not participated willingly, not had any mechanism of refusal available to them, and Rome, upon reflection, decided that this was largely their problem. The stain did not transfer to the man who had imposed it. He was dead. It adhered to the women he had left behind, because Roman honor was not an accounting of what had been done to a person, it was an accounting of what that person had been seen to be involved in. Some of these women never married. Some were moved to remote wings of their family estates, seen by servants and essentially no one else, maintained in a form of suspended social existence that had no name in Roman law and no exit built into it. Their minds had gone, in many cases, to the place that minds go when the place the body inhabits becomes intolerable, inward, remote, the specific geography of someone who is physically present and somewhere else entirely. The trauma had no Latin name, no framework for treatment, no official acknowledgement that it existed. Rome looked away. Rome had always been extraordinarily skilled at looking away. 3 independent ancient voices, writing separately, from different distances, with different agendas, converge on the same pattern. Suetonius, who had access to court documents and the appetite of a true researcher, even when his sensationalism got the better of his rigor. Cassius Dio, who worked across a gap of generations, but brought a senatorial intelligence to his reconstruction of how power had functioned. Tacitus, whose direct account of this reign has been mostly lost, but whose other work establishes, as clearly as any historical writing ever has, what the atmosphere of absolute power does to the people closest to it. And Philo of Alexandria, the eyewitness, who confirmed the cold calculation without the salacious embellishment, who saw a man who was fully in control of what he was doing. What those voices together describe is not a madman who broke loose from a functional civilization. They describe the civilization functioning exactly as designed. Rome had built a single office and placed into it every instrument of power available to human organization, legislative, judicial, military, divine. It had created no structural check on what happened if the wrong person occupied that office. It had built its conception of female honor in a way that transferred the cost of male predation onto the women it victimized, and it had created, through decades of imperial consolidation, a culture of court compliance so total that the men best positioned to stop what was happening had been converted into the mechanism of its continuation. Their compliance was its architecture. Their silence was its load-bearing wall. Caligula did not construct the total environment. He inherited it from Tiberius, who had used it on Capri, who had in turn inherited it from the concentrated authority of Augustus. He inherited it and ran it at maximum capacity, without any of the political moderation that prior emperors had found strategically useful. He was not constrained by a desire to be loved, or by the council of advisers he respected, or by any residual attachment to the norms of the civilization he had grown up inside and watched destroy his family. He was constrained by nothing, and the women at those dinner tables, the ones who went home and were moved to the remote wings of houses and never married, the ones whose names appear in the ancient sources as subordinate clauses in accounts of their husbands' humiliations, they were not collateral damage. They were the point, because humiliating the men of Rome required using the people those men were supposed to protect, because the total environment is only total when every person in it has been made complicit, and because the most efficient way to demonstrate absolute power to an entire class of powerful men is to take what they most want to protect and make them watch you take it and make them nod. He wanted witnesses, he wanted participants, he wanted 30 senators to carry for the rest of their lives the specific memory of a specific night at a specific table where a goblet was refilled and a voice in the room described in detail the qualities of someone's wife, and nobody said a word, and the wine was drunk, and the conversation resumed, and every man in that room added one more stone to the wall of silence he was building between himself and what he had seen. He was right that they would carry it. They did. What Caligula miscalculated, what the system he had inherited and extended had never fully reckoned with, was the particular arithmetic of humiliation. You can push the calculation far. You can make men pay a great deal in exchange for survival. But every payment changes the calculation of what the next payment is worth. And at some point, at the point where the cost of one more night at the table exceeds the cost of ending all further payments, the math shifts. In a covered corridor beneath the Palatine Hill, on January 24, 41 AD, the math shifted. The names Rome tried to erase are still here. Livia Orestilla, taken from her husband at her own wedding and discarded within days. Lollia Paulina, summoned from the edge of empire and left permanently banned from any future life. Drusilla, whose death broke the emperor in a way no Latin term could adequately describe, and whose place in this story has been sensationalized into something simpler and less true than the reality, which is that she was a person who mattered to a monstrous man, and whose absence completed his conversion into the thing Capri had been making him. Caesonia, his final wife, who the sources say loved him with a genuine ferocity, and who was killed within hours of his assassination, her infant daughter killed alongside her, because the new regime could not afford any loose thread connecting to Caligula's line. These are not footnotes. They are the evidence that the cost of unchecked power is always paid first and most completely by the people the system was never designed to protect. That evil operating at the scale of an empire does not arrive wearing its own face. It arrives wearing the face of order, of tradition, of dinner parties conducted according to correct form in torchlight that catches the silver on the table and the faces of powerful men keeping very still and the specific quality of wine being poured into a goblet while something happens in the room that nobody will name. The total environment does not announce itself. It constructs itself out of the ordinary materials of civilization, hierarchy, obligation, the social logic of people who depend on each other's goodwill for their survival, and it uses those materials to make the cost of refusal higher than the cost of compliance, and then a little higher, and then a little higher still, until the compliance is so deep and so old that it no longer feels like a choice that was made. It feels like the way things simply are, until someone in a dim corridor, a decorated soldier with a sword and a patience that finally ran out, decides to show that the way things simply are is not the same as the way things have to be. Caligula came from Rome, from a camp on the Rhine where soldiers taught a small boy in miniature boots that power is taken, not inherited. From an island where survival required 6 years of smiling at the man who killed his mother. From a senate that handed one person the authority of gods and spent 4 years discovering what that person would do with it. He came from a system, and when he was gone, the system remained, in Claudius's careful silence, in the money paid to families who agreed to forget, in the architecture of the Palatine Hill, that outlasted everyone who had ever suffered inside it. The names in the margins of those histories are still legible. They have been waiting for someone to read them slowly enough to hear what they were trying to say. You just did.